The Man-Eater of PaharPani by Edgar Carrington Turner. During my career in the Indian Forest Service, I spent no less than 14 years in Kumaon, the land of man-eating tigers. In spite of such hungry, roving, and terrifying carnivora, there was for me no more delightful country in all the wide world. I traversed every mountainside. The climate was exceptionally bracing, and wherever I went, I found the people friendly and cooperative. My tours occupied 9 months in the year. Only in July, August, and September was camping impossible on account of heavy, continual showers of rain, bringing the annual rainfall up to 100 inches. Though snow fell during December and January, it did not detract from the pleasures of an outdoor life. It was during one of such tours that I met the Man-Eater of PaharPani, a camping site about 6,000 feet above sea level and situated at the head of the Gaula Valley amongst a forest of oaks and rhododendrons. Work in this valley kept me extremely busy. In addition to settlement operations, there was much to be done in connection with the commercial exploitation of the pine forests. To aggravate matters, 3 of my tree-marking officers suffered from malaria and were bedridden. The situation was developing into a crisis as far as I was concerned, so much so that I decided on doing tree marking myself. While I was thus engaged, one of my men called out to me in urgent warning. He was higher up the hill, while I was studying the silvicultural aspect of certain trees about 25 yards from him. I was unable to make out what he said, but got the gist of it sufficiently to stand alert with my eyes on the intervening ground. Almost immediately I saw, some 8 feet to my left, a golden-colored cobra. Erect and with hood expanded, it slithered straight down the slippery mat of amber-hued pine needles. There were no stones at hand, so I picked up a small branch and hurled it as the snake approached. In doing so, I slipped and fell, and for a moment felt true panic, but the cobra continued its precipitous journey downhill. That same day, crossing the Gaula River while returning to my camp at the village of Kumaon, I saw 2 very black cobras, the exact color of the rocks in the bed of the stream. I was then in a better state of mind to admire these perfect cases of nature's camouflage. A day or 2 later came disturbing news from the range officer of the territory concerned that building work on the rest house at PaharPani was held up by the presence of a man-eating tiger. PaharPani was at the extreme head of the valley. It was a road junction and so a convenient site for a rest house. The plan of the new bungalow provided for a veranda, 2 main bed-sitting dining rooms, and 2 bathrooms. But these features meant less to me than the requirement that the construction must be completed by the end of March, the close of the financial year. Harlal, the contractor engaged in constructing the house, reported that it was impossible to complete the project in time. His masons and carpenters were deserting him in their fear of the man-eater, which had recently killed a villager very near PaharPani. This information was doubly unpleasant. If the rest house was not completed in time and payment made to Harlal, it meant that the substantial amount of money allotted for the purpose would lapse. In the world of officialdom, such lapsing of funds was almost tantamount to a criminal offense. It was argued that an officer had no right to include in his budget an amount which he could not spend within the financial year. To make excuses was futile. They were never accepted by very important persons who, as they ascended to the highest rungs of the ladder, were prone to lose complete touch with the difficulties of the executive branch of the administration, difficulties which included such matters as malaria and man-eaters. There was only one decision in such circumstances: to go to PaharPani and, on arrival there, to stand over Harlal's workers with a gun. This, I hoped, would instill them with a sense of urgency as well as confidence, and so enable progress to be made with the building. I therefore altered the whole of my itinerary. Moving camp daily, I reached Raikuna and spent the night there. The following day, I was on the march to PaharPani. I was within 200 yards of it when, as was my practice, I looked down from the right edge of the road to a small plot of cultivation in a depression with a tiny hut as a humble homestead. I expected to exchange greetings with Gusain, its owner. He usually came up to the road to meet me, but on this occasion there was no attempt to do so. He sat at the foot of a tree a few feet in front of his hut, and ignoring my call, he continued to sit with his head buried in his hands. Gusain belonged to the caste known as Dom, and he was actually dubbed as an untouchable. He could only give his sons and daughters in marriage to the sons and daughters of another Dom and to no other caste. His one comfort was that he was a Hindu, but even so he could not enter a temple. Watching him for a few moments, I concluded he was not well, so I went down to see what was wrong and to know if I could do anything to help him and his family. As I approached, I saw that his lean, ill-nourished body was shaken with deep sobs. I could see nobody else. The hut stood deserted, and there were none of the usual children running around. Eager to know the cause of his sorrow, I waited for him to recover. When he had done so slightly, he looked up at me, the tears still streaming down his cheeks. He could scarcely speak, and I found it difficult to make out his few incoherent words. I sat on the ground near him and gently asked him to repeat what he had said. Speaking haltingly through his sobs, he said, "He has taken my wife and children. Now I am all alone. A few days ago he came again. I had a very narrow escape. I climbed this tree just in time, but it would have been better had he taken me too." Gusain did not mention the word for tiger, but referred to the animal as Wuh, which translated is he or it. There was no need for me to ask him what he meant by Wuh. I had already understood. All I could do to comfort the old man was to give him some money to buy a generous quantity of grain and stores. While he remained silent, wiping away his tears, only for more to cover his face, I studied the environments. He had about an acre of arable land. The meager crop on it was in urgent need of weeding. It looked so neglected. Speaking again, Gusain said, "This is my home. It is all I have. Where can I go?" I felt for him very, very deeply. His loss was irreparable. I said I would see what can be done for him, adding I would do my utmost to kill the man-eater. The surroundings of Gusain's modest holding were very much in favor of the man-eater. There was an oak forest with dense bush, giving the tiger excellent cover and enabling him to approach near the hut. He could spring on his victim, giving him or her no chance whatsoever. Gusain had built himself a platform in a tree between 6 and 7 feet from the ground, and from this he had a better view of the surrounding undergrowth. I gave him permission to cut away the bushes as far as he liked in order to improve visibility all around this arboreal perch. When he was able to talk a little more, I inquired when the man-eater had taken his wife and children. "Over 2 months ago," he replied. Then, with a clearer remembrance of the time, he added, "Before the contractor and his men came to build the bungalow." Leaving Gusain, I went to my tents, which had been pitched near the site of the partly completed rest house. Harlal and his masons and carpenters expressed themselves pleased to see me. They were all huddled together in their temporary hut, and like all hillmen, when not working, they were smoking their chilams, or a small conical-shaped clay pipe held in both hands while inhaling. No time was lost in discussing the situation. I assured them of full protection against the man-eater, at least during daylight. I pointed out, however, that much time had been lost, and inquired what they were going to do about it. I was pleasantly surprised when, with one voice, they said that now I was with them, they would work overtime to do their utmost to complete the building in the shortest possible time, and certainly before the end of the financial year. I suspected that the contractor had offered them handsome rewards. He could indeed afford to do so, as the rates for all items were generous. But to see the men's spirit of cooperation gave me great comfort. Answering my inquiries about the tiger's latest activities, they could give me no definite details beyond what they had heard of a tragedy between PaharPani and the next camping place of Mornaula. This latest killing and those that preceded it indicated that the tiger was a growing menace to this particular locality. Standing near the unfinished building, I decided where to station myself while the masons and carpenters were at work. Below the site was the main road from Dhari. Here, the bridle path from Raikuna met it. From this junction, the main road continued on to Mornaula, about 5 miles distant in a general easterly direction. Visibility was good in all these directions, and it was most unlikely that the man-eater would expose himself by walking along these roads during the daytime. The danger lay to the north, where there was an oak forest which came down almost to the site itself. Under the trees there was enough undergrowth to give the tiger all the cover he required to make an unseen approach. The width of the clearing between the site and the scrub was not more than 12 yards. Understandingly, these conditions had made Harlal and his employees nervous. Being unarmed, no one could possibly blame them for refusing to work. It was just fear and not a strike. The tiger could have charged out of the undergrowth and sprung upon any of them while they were fashioning stones or making door frames. Here, everything was in the enemy's favor. Accordingly, I decided to stand with my gun between the unfinished building and the forest. Punctually, to the minute, the workmen resumed work the following day. For my part, I loaded my double-barreled rifle and stood, vigilant and ready to shoot, looking keenly to left and right and center for a glimpse of a long, tawny, black-striped body. This guard duty lasted with brief intervals for meals for at least 8 hours a day, and sometimes longer, but it had to be done if the building was to be completed in good time. In such circumstances, there arises in one's mind the fullest appreciation of the vast difference between stalking and being stalked. As you stand, and continue to stand, hour after hour, and day after day, the first resolute feelings begin gradually to disappear. Some measure of relaxation begins to set in, and unless you keep yourself up to the required degree of vigilance, extremely peculiar feelings begin to run up and down your spine. Very definitely, I used to say to myself, I prefer to stalk a man-eater than be stalked by him. No incident occurred. Daily I stood like a sentry, but with the considerable difference that whereas my hours were very much longer, the alertness demanded was no less than that required in war. All the time I was hoping most fervently that I would receive news of the tiger's whereabouts. As a forest officer, my position was very different from that of a freelance hunter. The latter's time is his own. He is at liberty to spend week after week in pursuit of his quarry. A forest officer, on the other hand, had to account fully for his time and actions in a diary or a fortnightly report submitted to his immediate supervisor. Such a document containing a sentence, "For the past 2 weeks I have been watching for a man-eating tiger," would most certainly have been promptly returned with the telling comment, "Such a pastime should be left to those who have unlimited leisure at their disposal. Your inspections have undoubtedly suffered." Without fear of such an adverse remark, the longest time I could spend at PaharPani was 10 days, with a full explanation justifying such a maximum period at one camp. I decided to make the best use of the time by sending out messages to the various headmen of villages to send me information about the man-eater's activities. The first news I received concerned a boy, about 15 years of age, who was sent by his father to bring his pony back from grazing to enable him to stable it for the night. The animal had wandered along the road and then decided to graze in a glade surrounded on 3 sides by an oak forest and on the 4th adjoining the main Dhari-PaharPani road, but nearer PaharPani than Dhari. The boy found the pony. Picking up a stick, he was determined to enjoy a gallop homewards. In his exuberance, he mounted at one end of the glade, used his whip freely, and his steed obeyed. At a gallop, he was approaching the other end of the glade, in full view of 2 wayfarers, when the pony swerved at almost right angles, throwing the boy onto the ground. And in a second, the tiger, crouching on the edge of the forest and waiting, pounced on the unfortunate lad and carried him away. The pony had suddenly seen the man-eater. The boy, in his excitement, had not. To its home the pony went as fast as it could. The two wayfarers returned and gave the sad news. It was too late for a beat. Early the following day, we searched the whole forest and beat it, but there was no sign of the tiger or the remains of the boy. 3 days later, the headman of Raikuna arrived to tell me that the tiger had been seen above his village in the forest about 200 yards above the houses. There was a definite reason for the man-eater to be wandering about there. In Kumaon, fresh oak leaves are gathered as a favorite fodder. While the men work in the fields, the women, after completing the morning's chores, take their dharantis, or heavy sickles made for cutting branches, and go in groups to the nearest oak forest to lop the trees. Each woman returns with a large headload of leaf fodder. A man-eating tiger of this district usually is well aware of this practice, and he fits in his movements accordingly. His adopted way of life compels him to follow the ways of man, so he will wander by day and sleep by night. He will temporarily reverse this order if his appetite has been satisfied, but otherwise his hunting is done by day. That is why he was seen above Raikuna village. He was waiting for a group of women to come up, as usual, for leaf fodder, intending to snatch one of them on the ground or from an accessible branch of a tree. During my years of travel in Kumaon, I heard of several cases where women had been dragged down from low-branching trees by man-eaters. At nearly all road junctions in Kumaon, there was a small shop where the owner did a moderate amount of business with wayfarers who would sit on a bench, have a snack, a smoke, and impart the latest news. The shopkeeper, as a good trader, would pass on the important items to others. PaharPani boasted such a gossip shop. The owner prospered, and in time employed a servant whose wife went daily to the nearby oak trees and brought back leaf fodder for the shopkeeper's cow. While she was busy in the tree lopping the small branches with their leaves, she felt the tree violently shaken. Looking down, she was horrified to see the man-eater. He had struck, hoping to reach her left leg, which, although on a lower branch, was luckily out of his reach. Instinctively, making her position safer by climbing higher in the tree, she called out as loudly as she could for help. Her husband, who was busy at the shop, answered her and then ran to me. I was standing guard over the masons and carpenters who had also heard the woman calling out, and had stopped work to listen intently. Advising them to retire to their hut and to remain there, I went in search of the man-eater. There was none sufficiently reliable to accompany me with a second rifle. I, therefore, desired no company. My immediate problem was to find the precise whereabouts of the tiger. Was he still close by? Or had he wandered off through the forest after he had failed to pull the woman down from the tree? My only source of information on these important questions was the woman in the tree. Moving warily along the road, I looked above and below it, expecting a charge and a spring at any moment. At the same time, I glanced up into the trees to catch a sight of the woman. 3 or 4 steps further on, I saw her. She had evidently been watching my progress as our eyes met at once. I made a sign of inquiry. She pointed down to her right. This I took to indicate that she had not wandered far from the scene of his attempt. But still the question in my mind was, where precisely was he? It was essential that I should see him first and not vice versa. Tiptoeing 4 or 5 steps further, I looked up again quickly at the woman. The tree on which she was now safe was only a few feet from the lower edge of the road. A few yards further on was a dry watercourse about 5 feet wide and 4 feet deep. From the tree to the watercourse, in a southeasterly direction, I judged the distance to be 8 yards. In response to my second inquiring look, the woman pointed again to the same spot. Straining my eyes in that direction, I still could get no glimpse of the tiger. Standing motionless for a second or two, I decided that the only place he could be in was the watercourse, the head of which was just below the road. I had passed it during my inspections and noted it was a danger to the stability of the lower edge of the road as erosion increased year after year. I now felt the need of a companion who could have reconnoitered this tricky bit of country, but on my own there was only one line of action. That was to approach the head of the watercourse by continuing along the road and looking down at it. The question now was, which of us would see the other first? Putting my rifle up to my shoulder, since every second now counted, I stepped forward to obtain a quick view of the watercourse. There was the man-eater, facing upwards towards the woman. The moment he saw me, he snarled fiercely, and I was aware of him coming straight at me. But simultaneously my first bullet found its mark and he fell. As he did so, I fired again and reloaded. Keeping my aim on him, I watched for a moment. He was still. It was the end of the man-eater of PaharPani. I asked the woman to call to her husband to bring several men and a charpoy, or an Indian bed, since this would be the most convenient and the quickest arrangement to carry the tiger to the camp. The men came running along as though they were having a race. It took their combined efforts to drag the man-eater out of the watercourse and place him on a charpoy to carry to the camp. He was well past middle age. His canine teeth were intact, but he had lost all the incisors. 2 molars were missing. On examining his legs, I found 2 claws broken. Otherwise, he was in quite good condition. From his nose to the tip of his tail, he measured 9 feet 5 inches. As usual, there were many requests for the man-eater's fat. The people in the hills, like those in the plains, believe firmly in its efficacy for rheumatic complaints. The shopkeeper, Tara Dutt, a Kumaoni Brahmin, was so jubilant at the death of the man-eater that he served out gram and jaggery free of cost to all present. Knowing his reputation for stinginess, I looked at him in surprise. "It is quite all right," he remarked. "There will now be more wayfarers on this route, and therefore I will do more business." That very lonely figure, Gusain, had left his hut and now sat staring at the tiger that had taken his wife and children. The tears ran down his cheeks when I spoke to him. No act of mine could bring a full measure of comfort to his deeply scarred heart. The most I could do to bring some comfort into his shattered life was to appoint him on a monthly salary as caretaker of the rest house as soon as Harlal, the contractor, had completed it. 23 years later, I revisited PaharPani again in an official capacity. The scene had changed. Gusain had passed away. So had Tara Dutt. There was not a face I could recognize. The oak forest and the scrub, where I had stood like a sentry day after day, had been completely cleared, and in their place was a large field covered by a flourishing crop of potatoes. In all forest rest houses there is a visitor's book. When leaving PaharPani for the last time, I recorded in it, for the information of future generations of forest officers, the somewhat unusual circumstances in which the construction of the rest house had been completed on schedule. Before finally leaving this area, I would like to pose a question of unusual interest. Why are there man-eating tigers always in Kumaon? I have read every book published on man-eaters in this tract, but nowhere have I seen this question discussed and answered. There has never been a time when this territory has been without man-eaters. I heard of them when I first arrived in Kumaon in the year 1912. I have heard and read of them ever since, right up to the end of December 1955, when I was still in India. That means a period of 43 years, at the end of which the government was continuing to offer rewards for the destruction of man-eaters, and were even dispatching small parties of infantry and police to deal with the menace. As I see it, the reasons for a tiger turning man-eater in Kumaon are: A. Scarcity, or complete absence of his normal food, which consists of all species of deer, pig, cows, bullocks, and buffaloes. This is the principal reason. B. one or more disabilities brought about by wounds caused by 1. Inaccurate shooting or poor quality guns with inferior or unsuitable ammunition. 2. Mishaps or unfamiliar terrain such as steep hillsides. 3. Suppurating injuries due to the penetration of thorns and porcupine quills or from fights with other tigers. And C. The increasing handicaps inherent in advancing years, such as reduced agility with consequent inability to seize fleet-footed herbivores on mountain sides and loss of its weapons, the claws and teeth. If all the above reasons are carefully considered, it will be seen that they can be summarized in one word: hunger. There is the additional possibility of a man-eating tigress feeding her cubs on human flesh and so bringing them up to man-eating. This cannot be ruled out, as such cubs are bound to kill men, women, and children if they continue to live in an area of scarcity. Again, it is a question of hunger. There comes a time in the lives of all tiger cubs when their mothers no longer wish to have anything to do with them. They are made to understand that they must go and fend for themselves. If they persist in staying, then the mothers use violence, especially if about to have cubs again. We must, however, go back to their life histories in order to obtain a comprehensive understanding of how and why these man-eaters enter Kumaon, and will continue entering a territory that will always be characterized by an acute and growing scarcity, in very many places a complete absence of a tiger's normal food. Kumaon comprises the two districts of Nainital and Almora. Their southernmost parts are a long, unbroken range of mountains known as the foothills of the Himalayas. These give way in a southerly direction to a wide stretch of gently sloping ground which continues till it terminates in flat country extending away into the plains. Thus, there are three distinct zones. It is the middle one, the terrain with the gentle slope, which is so important. It is richly forested, holds an abundant stock of deer and pig, and has been, from time immemorial, an ideal breeding ground for tigers. It is essential to add that here they do not molest man unless molested by him. The dense forests continue for a portion of the way up the foothills, merging with increasing altitude into the oak pine flora, so that a tiger can enjoy continuous and sufficient cover when traveling from the middle to the upper zone. But why should a tiger quit the zone which is so well stocked with his normal food? The answer is the Darwinian phrase, the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest. It is a fact well known to forest officers that non-man-eating tigers and tigresses are local, and as a general rule, pairs keep their own well-defined territory. In due course, the pair have a family, usually of 2 cubs. As these grow up, they develop sufficient strength to become, in time, a match for their parents and become severely intolerant of their presence, with the result that the older pair will be driven out of their beat. Occasionally, the youngsters go into the adjoining beat and drive out the older generation there. This expulsion or destruction of the older is, of course, nothing new, and has been going on in the jungle from the beginning of time. The aged, increasingly enfeebled, must give way to the young, growing in strength. Losing the battle or avoiding it, the expelled tiger seeks refuge in the adjoining hilly zone of Kumaon. In doing so, he unknowingly enters a strange tract where life is extremely hard. His normal food is too scarce to sustain him, and the circumstances, taken collectively, so thoroughly unfavorable that he is compelled to choose a new way of life. The pangs of hunger sting more and more, and point in the inevitable direction of the easiest of prey, human beings. In other words, in accordance with an inexorable law of nature, the younger generation of tigers in the breeding grounds are constantly pushing the older into the hills, where a tiger finds it impossible to live unless he resorts to human flesh. This, then, is the reason why there are, and always will be, man-eaters in Kumaon. No matter how many may be killed from time to time, others will appear in their place. Tigers, which have entered the foothills, go occasionally further into the mountains. Such journeys are the result of the annual movement of villagers with their small herds of cattle. When they return in spring, From the sub-montane tract, their herds are sometimes followed by tigers hoping to get a straggling cow or bullock, or one which lingers by the wayside through sickness or weakness. That is why a man-eater is encountered in higher altitudes, like Ramgarh, Muktesar, and Agar, all of which places are from 6,500 feet to over 7,000 feet above sea level. He continues to follow the herds which, with their owners, eventually scatter to their respective villages, leaving the tiger stranded. In the new locality, he must, in order to keep himself alive, continue to kill and eat human beings. The end.